Once upon a time, far away, which at the same time is just here and only yesterday, there was a kind-hearted man that lived at the edge of the town. Even though he was kind and he did his best in his life to be good, over the years he'd got tangled and stuck and slow. Hooks and ties and binds and strings and threads had all got attached to him over the years. And these hooks and ties and binds and ribbons were pulling him in different directions. And every time he tried to move forward, he felt the weight of the world was dragging him back. In fact, when he tried to move these days or make changes, the weight was so much it slowed him down and stooped him as he walked. The ever-watchful moon watched this with concern. The thing about the ties and the binds is they didn't happen overnight. They happened one at a time over many years. When he was a young man, one tie or rope hardly affected him. But they remained unchecked. They remained hanging there over the years. And so a heartache added a tie, a disappointment added a bind, a betrayal added a chain, a loss added a thread, a debt, a grief, a lie, all of these things, one by one, added chains to this good man's heart and to this good man's soul, until they began to pull him out of all recognition. He felt contorted, he felt confused, and he felt like he was losing himself. And the moon, ever watchful, watched on in concern. Unfortunately, as the moon became more watchful, which was out of the good of her own heart, he felt the gaze of the moon and he couldn't sleep, and the worries and the ties pulled at him more and more. Well, one night, late October, the watchful moon had had enough of watching. It was Samhain, or All Hallows' Eve, and the moon of all beings knew what this meant, that anything is possible, and the veils between the worlds are thin. And so, one dark Samhain night, the moon took her cloak and wrapped it tightly around herself. She only used this cloak on very special occasions, and it was when she chose to wander and walk amongst the living on the earth. The moon put her cloak on and glided down from the heavens until she walked the streets of earth on Halloween. There were children dressed as ghouls and monsters, as vampires and old-fashioned witches. There was plastic decorations, there was pumpkins, there was fire, and there was laughter in the streets for the most part, and this made the moon smile. With all the excitement, no one really noticed the moon walking past. No one saw the faint glow underneath the great cloak. And if they did, they thought it was a wonderful costume. And the moon's magic made them soon forget what they had seen. Apart from the witches, the wise ones, the women of the hills and the hearth, when they saw her walk past, they turned from their fires, they looked out their windows, and they smiled a little, and they knew. The Tangled man was sitting by his own fire, eating a small meal, when the doorbell rang. And he thought, brilliant, more trick-or-treaters. He had brought lots of sweets for them all, and he was excited to be sharing the sweets with the children and seeing all their costumes and scaring them with the decorations that he had put outside his own house. So he went to the door, armed with sweeties, and he saw not a child with a costume, but a woman, beautiful and somewhat disturbing, shining in his doorway, covered by the cloak of darkest night. She smiled kindly and beckoned to him to follow her. He found he had no control over his actions. She was mesmerizing, hypnotizing, and he just knew in his heart and his tangled soul that this is what he needed to do. So he followed the moon out of his house. He followed her down the streets, through the children running, through the decorations and the spooky sounds and the screams of laughter. They were all walking the other way, and no one really noticed them. The moon was seen by those she allowed to see her, and not by those she didn't. And so they walked to the edge of the town. And at the edge of the town was a great wood, a great forest. And the man thought to himself that he hadn't been there for so many years. These are the woods and the trees that he called his friends when he was young, when he was a child, and he would make dens and tree houses, and he would pretend he was a pirate or Robin Hood, and he would spend his summer days and evenings there playing with his friends. He would walk his dogs there when he was younger. And as he walked into the forest, he remembered all these things, and he felt sad that he hadn't done any of these for such a long while, and he hadn't visited these woods. However, it was Halloween, and it was very dark, and he did feel rather afraid. There was funny sounds coming from the woods, laughter, noises that he didn't quite recognise. And this man, while he wasn't a fan of horror movies, he didn't like seeing the horror movies that came up around Halloween because they added more chains to his heart and soul. Every time he saw something like that, it made him believe that people weren't good, and it added more weight to the ties that were binding him. Even though he didn't watch horror movies, he knew he was walking into something that seemed a little bit like one. A strange lady hypnotising him and walking him into the woods on Halloween night. He thought, this might not end well. But he couldn't stop himself. She was mesmerising. And to be honest, nothing this amazing had happened to him for quite a long while. As he walked, he tired easily. The binds, the ties and the chains, they all got caught on the woods. They all got caught on branches and leaves, and they made him slow and cumbersome. But the moon was patient. She waited for him, and she carried on walking, and he followed. They walked for quite a while, until suddenly she walked and she disappeared. All he saw was a hand appearing out of the darkness, beckoning him forward. But the rest of this woman, the rest of this strange lady, had all but disappeared. But he was too far in to give up now. Whatever was going on, he was going to see it through to the end. And his good heart told him somewhere that this was a good woman, and that he needed to do this. So he followed where the bodiless hand beckoned, and then the hand disappeared completely, and he saw a wobbly waviness in the air. There was mist, And he'd seen enough science fiction movies to know this looked like some kind of portal, some kind of gateway between the worlds. But he put his hand in, he took a deep breath, and his hand disappeared. He put his arm in, his arm disappeared. He put his leg, and then his whole body got sucked in, and the man had disappeared. On the other side of the gateway, it was still the woods, but the woods were not the woods that he knew. It was full of cloaked figures. It was full of laughter, of dancing, of strange, well, you'd have to say fairy creatures, some of them mesmerising, a bit like the lady that had walked him to this place, and some quite terrifying, and some wearing cloaks, and he couldn't see their faces, but he felt very afraid. The faces and the fairies and the people that had gathered to meet him were all holding knives. Some of them had scissors in their hands, and they were snip, snip, snipping in the air, and they were laughing, and their eyes looked mischievous, and he thought quite monstrous, and he grew very afraid. What have I done? I've walked into a horror movie. I've walked into something terrible. This will not end well. The faces that glowed in the dark, the creatures that danced around him with their knives, with their scythes, and with their snipping scissors. Well, if he'd looked a little closer, he would have perhaps recognised some of them. There amongst the throng of fairies and of ghouls was his old auntie that passed away many years ago. Was his childhood dog, running around and howling in the night. Was his grandmother at the back, waiting and smiling. There were lots of fairies and wild beings too, and the spirits of the trees that he loved as a child, and they all waited with their sharp objects and their scissors, snip, snip, snipping. Well, the man was terrified, but he knew there was nothing he could really do. He didn't even know where the portal was to return back to his own world. And so, as the drumming increased and the music began to play louder and louder, and these beings started dancing around him, slowly, then faster and faster, they spiraled around him, snip, snip, snipping, with knives and scythes and scissors, all cutting. And he closed his eyes, and he waited for that fatal blow. The fatal blow that never came. After a moment, he began to open his eyes, tentatively, slowly, and he saw all these beings and creatures laughing and laughing at him, and snip, snip, snipping. He'd never seen the chains and the threads and the ribbons and the binds that held him before, even though he felt their presence. But now he saw them as clear as day. The fairies, the ancestors, the auntie, and wasn't that even his old dog? They were all cutting him free from these bonds. They were cutting the ties, and they were removing them, and they were taking them away to place on the great fire. He saw the fairies and the ancestors, and he recognised some of their faces, and he saw them trying really hard to get every tie and every ribbon and every bind from out of him, every hook. And he felt amazing. He was the child, he was the young man, he was the boy with the big heart and the man with the big dream. Everything that was him was still him, and he could see it and feel it because the weight of the chains and the bonds and the ties had all gone. And the fairies and the ancestors were laughing. And he began to laugh too. He felt his back, his head, his arms. Not one hook or chain held him back. And as the fairies and the ancestors began to dance, he joined them too, light as a feather, open, warm and kind as he always had been. And he remembered that he'd seen the fairies when he was a child, and he remembered that he'd seen the lights in the forest dancing at night time at the summer solstice. And he danced and he feasted, for this was Samhain, and it was a feast of the ancestors, and it was a feast of the fairies, and he feasted and danced with them. And as the long night drew to a close, the moon touched his arm, and he smiled, and she led him through the portal, saying goodbye to the ancestors and the fairies. And she led him through the woods, to the edge of the forest, to the edge of the town. And she led him back home and kissed his forehead, and she smiled. For this was not the man that she'd taken to the woods at the beginning of the night. The years and cares and problems had all fallen from his brow. He was walking straight and tall. He was excited. He was free. And everyone knew there was a difference in the kind-hearted man. Everyone saw that he was happy. There was a skip in his step. He did many things for the community and for the environment. He created beautiful things, and he was a joy and a pleasure to be around from that day forth. And every Halloween, he walked into the woods, and the wise witches from the hills and the hearth watched him. They turned from their fires and looked at him out the window, and they smiled knowingly. And from the forests and the woods, if you listened carefully on Halloween, could be hear the howling of laughter, of dancing, of merriment, and the snip, snip, snip of scissors and knives.